to someplace more interesting. So, nonetheless, we are here, and we have the opportunity to consider God's Word together. This evening, we are on page 12 of our lesson books, and we are looking at how Jesus taught with authority and what made his teaching authoritative. Before we begin, though, Wayne, would you mind leading us in prayer?
Our Father, we're thankful that we've been able to come out tonight and study and pray to be with Matt as he presents the lesson. Help us as listeners and students to take what he said and apply it as best we can, search our hearts, and understand better how we can be like Jesus and be the way he taught. Pray, Father, that you'll be with this congregation as we reach out to little people. Pray that we'll have hearts that are receptive. Pray, Father, that you'll be with the ones that are not feeling well in this congregation. Especially remember John Green, he's recovering from surgery. Others that are having a hard time, we pray that you'll help them have a good time tonight. Be with us and all who say and Father, which we pray in Jesus' name.
Amen. Thank you, brother. All right, like I said, page 12, question 1. And we're going to be spending the entire evening, I expect, in Matthew 5. So if you just want to turn there in your Bibles, then you won't have to start flipping once I start asking. So then, first question says, in Matthew 5, 17 through 20, how does Jesus describe his purpose? What does he say will lead to either honor or shame in the kingdom of heaven? Does this mean that Jesus is replacing the commandments he cites in the rest of the chapter? If not, what does it mean? So, let's begin by reading Matthew 5, 17 through 20 together. And who would like to read that? Matthew 5, 17 through 20. Volunteers? Okay, Lester, read away, brother. All right, thank you, brother. So, first question in this little block. How does Jesus describe his purpose in this reading? What does he say that he is not come to do, and what has he, on the other hand, come to do? He's not come to do what? Yes, he's not trying to destroy the law, not trying to abolish the law. Instead, he has come to fulfill the law. And what does he say will lead to either honor or shame in the kingdom of heaven? What will lead to you being called least in the kingdom? There in verse 19. Right. That if you are not doing the law yourself, you're teaching somebody else to do the same, you will be least. But on the other hand, you will, what's the opposite there in verse 19? What's that? Yes, that's right. That if you do the law and you teach the law, then you'll be called what? You'll be called great in the kingdom. So, we know that the law of Moses was nailed to the cross with Christ. But does all this mean that Jesus is replacing the commandments he cites in the rest of the chapter? Because all the way through he's going to be saying, you heard that it was said, but I say to you. Does this mean that Jesus is going through and rewriting the law of Moses? Does that reading of this text seem in line with what we saw here. This is a big rewrite job. I see head shaking. I agree with the head shaking. So if that's not what it means, then how do we read it when Jesus says, I'm here to fulfill, I'm here to teach, I'm here to get others to do these things and do them myself? And then he says, you've heard that it was said, but I say to you. How do we reconcile these ideas? How do we? Yes, that's certainly what Jesus said is what we needed to do. But even 2,000 years ago, before there was such a thing as a Christian, was Jesus trying to get all these Jews and his audience to be bad Jews? Instead, what is going to be true of a Jew who takes everything that Jesus says in the rest of the chapter and does it?
I think the key is in verse 20. I think he's saying you have to exceed. You have to do more. Your righteousness has to be greater than the scribes and Pharisees. And so when he says, you have heard but I say, he's not saying don't worry about what you've heard. He's saying I'm adding some stuff to that. You need to go further than just what the scribes and Pharisees said.
Definitely so, sir.
Yeah, I would use maybe different words with the same concept. That Jesus is trying to intensify the teaching of the Torah so that it is clear that you are not just to know it, but to live it. And that's a key to living life well.
Yes, I think that is exactly so. That Jesus here, what he's saying is not really forward-looking, it's backward-looking. This is recalling the Jews to the original sense of God's teaching, the original purpose of all of those commandments. And so once we see that, then that tells us how we need to read everything else that Jesus is saying. Instead of just going formally through these commandments while robbing them of their substance, Jesus is saying that instead you need to think about what these commandments are supposed to do to your heart. So even though Jesus here is working with the law of Moses, I think this tells us a lot about how we ought to look at what God has revealed to us as well. Anything else on this? All right. Let's look then at the next couple. Who wants to read Matthew 5, 21 through 30? Any volunteers? All right, read, Drew. Right. So, the question 2 there says, for the 5 passages cited below, identify the teaching from the law that Jesus quotes, how it is being misused, how Jesus corrects the misuse, and then how he applies it correctly. So, what is in Matthew 5, 21 through 24, what is the teaching from the law that Jesus is quoting? Talking about what? Yes. This is do not kill. If you do, you will be liable to the judgment. How is this being misused? The text doesn't spell it out so much, but what can we learn from Jesus' words about what his audience was getting wrong? Yes, that these are people who are totally fine with being angry and hateful, and they think that they can wander around and they're nurturing all of this hatred in their hearts, but as long as they don't kill anybody, then that's just perfectly fine. So what does Jesus say to correct this misunderstanding? With his, but I say to you. What's the point? Yes, and that's the idea. He says, effectively, it is good to be aware of the commandment not to murder. Jesus is not being pro-murder here, but he is saying, be aware that the condition of holding hatred toward your brother in your heart is just as dangerous as murdering somebody would be. So, what then is the instruction? What does Jesus say we ought to be getting from the commandment not to murder? Yeah?
It's not just hatred that leads to contempt. I've heard people say, well, I don't hate him, I just think he's an idiot. Okay, be contemptuous of your brother comes too. That it's any of those, well, I don't hate him, I'm just mad as fire at him. Okay, well, that counts too. That I'm afraid that sometimes we get into playing the same game, well, I didn't kill him. Well, I don't technically hate him. I think there's a reason that Jesus goes through, if you do this, you'll be liable. If you do that, you'll be liable. That is a whole range of negative emotions that Jesus is getting at.
To add to that, it's not just dislike and hatred, but I think the point is you have to let it go and not hold grudges and not seek revenge and have this burning anger that leads to so many poor choices in the life.
Absolutely. That, Gail? I think that is exactly right. In fact, I think there's kind of a common thread running through all three of those comments. Because when we think of the Pharisees, we think of the Pharisees liking to put a fence around the law. We know this stuff in the middle is wrong, so we're going to make sure that you don't even get close to the stuff that you know is wrong. We're going to make up all these other rules. But the funny thing is that we see exactly the opposite happening here. That rather than building a fence around the commandment not to murder, instead the Pharisees are interested in seeing just how close they can get to that line. I can be murderously enraged, I can be murderously contemptuous, and all of these things are perfectly fine as long as I don't commit the actual act. And I think we see that same tendency to look at this and say, this is hard. I want to minimize the impact on my life as much as possible here. And I heard it in what Lauren said, and I heard it in what Gail said too. Because I don't know that I really struggle on a daily basis with hating people and want to kill them. That's just, maybe that's your struggle. Maybe you're on the highway more than I am, but that's just not where I am. But how about being contemptuous? How about being contemptuous when you hear or see somebody online who says something that you disagree with politically, and you think they're the biggest idiot on the planet? Do we see that as a spiritual problem? Do we see that as a violation of Matthew 5? Or my brother does something to me. I am convinced that he sinned against me in doing that. But I'm going to say I forgive him. Not because that is difficult for me, but because it is easy. Because if I just forgive him in my heart, quote unquote, and I don't go to him about his sin, then I can be passive aggressive and I can avoid this whole horrible confrontation. And by so doing, we have ripped the guts out of the divine commandment. And that is, I think, much of what Jesus is trying to communicate here. The idea is not to see just how much you can get away with. The idea is to see how much you can glorify God in your heart. So, any other thoughts on that? Let's talk about 27 through 30 then. What is Jesus quoting here in Matthew 5:27? Yes. Do not commit adultery. This is Exodus 20 and 14, among other places. So, what is the way that this is apparently being misused? You have this commandment, do not commit adultery. What probably does Jesus know his audience is up to with this? Yes, that once again, you have people trying to circumscribe the borders of the commandment. To say, I know that this act is wrong. So I'm going to define this act as strictly as I can, as narrowly as I can. Because once I do that, then it is going to give me freedom to do all sorts of other things. So there is our misuse. What does Jesus say instead? What does Jesus want us to appreciate? Yes. That if you are lusting in your heart and you are not committing the actual physical act, then what is going on is not that you don't want to sin, because in fact you do want to sin. It's just that there is something else that is preventing you. It is not God. Instead, maybe it's impossibility, that you cannot, you don't have the opportunity to consummate your lust. It might be that you are afraid of the earthly consequences if you do. And so, rather than going out and committing adultery, you just instead nourish your lust. So, that is what Jesus has to say. And how extreme does he say the remedy is here? Yes. This is shocking language, where what Jesus appears to be urging on the face of the commandment is self-mutilation. Is that actually what he is commending to us, though? And how do we know? Yes, that if I am lusting, and I recognize that I am lusting, and so I take the ice pick and I plunge it into my eye. I guess that was my left eye because I'm left-handed. Then I am going to go on lusting just as well with my right eye, aren't I? And so the problem is not with these poor, unoffending bodily organs that we are chopping out or puncturing or otherwise injuring. The problem is with what we are using them to do. And what is it instead that is within us that we need to be puncturing and chopping off and so on? What's that? It is the sin, it is the desire to sin. Don't use your body for sin. And I think Jesus is also saying don't even use your heart for sin. Especially don't use your heart for sin. And when it comes to something as universal as lust, I think this is something that we can all appreciate.
You may be getting to this, but I think that we're leading up to this passage about divorce. And if you think about it, one of the major causes of unhappiness in marriage is being angry and holding grudges and not letting go. And on one side and on the other side, you have this lust and this kind of betrayal of who you are as a person and the commitments that you make. And I think what Jesus is saying is, look, boys and girls don't do this. And he's also saying if it does happen, you need to be forgiving. And that leads to a happy life and a happy marriage. And I think maybe that's the concrete line he's going. Certainly not. I may be wrong. But I think if you do with anger and lust, you can resolve the wrong marital problem.
Yes, and we are up for money in the next chapter, as I recall. So, these things are certainly significant problems in all too many marriages, where you can have a marriage where, okay, maybe you haven't murdered your spouse, but you are embittered against your spouse, and so this is poisoning your heart. Maybe like Gail was talking about, there are these issues that you were not willing to work through for whatever reason, and so instead you're just keeping them inside you and they're destroying you. Or you are bound to one husband, you are bound to one wife, and yet there is somebody else who has captured your imagination. And so certainly, I think to Jesus' hearers, when he's talking about these things, especially talking about adultery, he is talking to married people here. And wanting us to appreciate just how extreme the remedy must be. Because the thing about lust and the thing about satisfying lust is that it's very pleasant, that this is something that the fleshly part of us likes to savor. But Jesus says you cannot savor. You must instead come in with fire and sword and burn it out of your heart.
Well, and we accuse the Pharisees of building hedges around walls. That's essentially what Jesus is doing here. He's saying, don't murder. But once you let hatred into your heart, you are not far at all from murder. So don't even let hatred in, and don't let bitterness into it. Don't commit adultery. But once you allow lust in, you are not far at all from committing adultery. And so don't even do it. And it's different when Jesus built a hedge than when a person built a hedge. But part of what Jesus is doing here is saying, yes, that one was still important, but recognize what leads to the sin that you're avoiding so assiduously, and make it easier on yourself by not even letting the first step in.
And I think that in what you say, there is a profound difference between what we see Jesus doing and what we see the Pharisees doing. You look at, for instance, the Pharisee custom of washing before meals. That just comes from the ritual laws of purification about how if you touch a dead body or something, then you have to bathe in water and you have to be unclean until evening. And the Pharisees said, well, you might have touched something, so just to be on the safe side, you need to wash. The Pharisees looked at the commandment not to work on the Sabbath, and they said, so because we have this command, then we need to put all these other rules in place that define what is working and what is not working, which is where in Scripture we have this idea of the Sabbath day's journey. That if you travel any farther than this, then you have done work. What's the difference between that way of thinking and what Jesus is doing here? What's the difference between going from keep the Sabbath holy to only go this far on the Sabbath and going from don't kill to don't hate? What's the difference? There's something very profound about the way that the Pharisees are moving as opposed to the way that Jesus is moving. Anybody see it? What? Yeah, that's how far they were gone. That they had all of these rules, and when Jesus comes in and works a miracle on the Sabbath, there must be something wrong with Jesus because he's breaking their rules. So you have, I guess, in that sense, you have this way of thought that once you follow it to its logical conclusion, it defeats the work of God. But why does that happen? What have the Pharisees not done when it comes to their hedge around the law? First of all, who are they trying to regulate? And second of all, where are they trying to regulate?
I'll take a stab at that. Maybe think of the parable of the Good Samaritan. Meaning the parable is that love overcomes ritual purity. And we see that from the example of the Levites who saw the guy crossed on the other side of the road. And maybe Jesus is saying that you've lost your sense of love and deeper feeling. It should infuse your life, but it should motivate you to act. And instead, you're just going through the motions.
Yes. And I think that's basically it. Is when the Pharisees are building their hedge, they are building their hedge out of concrete actions, and they are doing it primarily to bind on other people. Because the Pharisees had all their little trapdoors and their cheats, right? They would buy up little pieces of land to extend the distance they could travel on the Sabbath because they were not leaving their home behind. So they had their cheats and their trapdoors. Their rules didn't bind them. That's why Jesus says, you bind these heavy burdens on others. You don't lift them with your own finger. They're trying to control other people. So it's outward and it's aimed at others. What Jesus is saying is look inwardly, aim it at yourself. Work on your own heart. And if the Pharisees had done that, then would they have a problem with a prophet working miracles on the Sabbath? Because then they're not interested in controlling him, they are interested in controlling themselves. So, and anything else on that and what we see Jesus trying to get us to do as we are considering this, and what's more, do we see how Jesus is thinking here? Do we see how he is constantly saying, look inward, ask what you are trying to get away with inside the silence of your own heart where you think nobody can see it, and you're not actually getting away with anything? Okay, let's do some more reading then. Who wants to read verses 31 through 37? Volunteers to tackle that.
It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give
So, what have we got here then in Matthew 5:31 and 32? Thank you for reading, by the way. What have these Jews heard was said? Yes. Yes. That if you're going to divorce your wife, then just make sure that you provide her with that piece of paper and you're good. By the way, has anybody ever gone through and worked through Deuteronomy 24 as to what it's actually saying? It's not actually that. Because what Moses' point is that if you divorce your wife and she marries somebody else and he divorces her, then you can't go back to her. That is the actual commandment in Deuteronomy 24. But instead, what the Jews did is they took what was just sort of a condition. You know, if you divorce your wife by giving her a certificate of divorce, then blah, 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 blah. They took that and they turned it into a commandment, which is about the same as, you know, there are commandments that start with, if a man is fighting with his neighbor. It's like taking, if a man is fighting with his neighbor and saying, well, that means that the law allows me to fight with my neighbor. It's a very bizarre read, first of all. And so what obviously were these folks doing with it? What were they doing with what they thought was a loophole in Deuteronomy 24? Yes. And the only question was just how broad is it? Because the specific language in Deuteronomy 24 is, if a man finds some indecency in his wife and gives her a certificate of divorce, then et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so there were arguments among the rabbinical schools of Jesus' day about what an indecency was. Does that mean that she cheated on you? Does that mean that she burned the soup? What is indecent? And yeah, they literally said burned the soup. I'm not making that up. So all of a sudden, the question becomes not what is God saying about marriage? The question becomes, what is God saying about divorce? And we wouldn't happen to have trouble with that one today, would we? Where the question becomes, all right, but is this a scriptural divorce? And that's an important discussion. But a much more important discussion is, what should we do when we have these two people whom God has joined together? How should we proceed from there? So what does Jesus then say about this practice of divorce? What are you doing when you divorce? Yes, you are driving somebody else into sin, and what's that? Yes, except for sexual immorality. Other than that, you are driving somebody into sin, because if they've gone into sin on their own, obviously you're not driving them there, so that no longer applies. And you are allowing this sinful condition to continue to propagate itself. So, what does Jesus want us to get from this? And what should we learn from the way that we see Jesus handling this issue? Yeah, that.
He's also saying, I hate divorce. And there are reasons for it that he spells out here, but he hates it. It was never intended to be a commonplace, but something to be thought through very carefully with respect to a forgiving attitude and a view of human weakness and discipline to not engage in those weaknesses.
And I think you're right in everything you say there. That the interesting thing about quoting from the discussion in Mark, that's where the Pharisees come and ask, is it lawful to divorce for any reason? When Jesus says that he gave you this commandment because of the hardness of your heart, I am not sure if that meant that Moses permitted them to divorce because of the hardness of their heart, or if he knew that they would, and so he is trying to limit collateral damage. I've been chasing that one around in my mind for years. And here too, you have Jesus both in a sense, the conclusion of the Sermon on the Mount is that people recognize that Jesus was teaching with authority. But at the same time, in the much longer discussion of this issue in Matthew 19 and in the account in Mark, where does he go to? Is he just standing his ground on his own naked authority, or is he looking back to something else? Yes. That Jesus' point is that when you look to Deuteronomy 24 for what God says about divorce, you're looking in the wrong place. That instead you ought to be looking in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 to see what God says about marriage. And once you figure out everything that God says about marriage, then it will also tell you what God has to say about divorce. And this, I think, is something that is important for those of us who identify as being part of the Restoration movement. Because what our call ought to be, at least, is back to the Bible. Let's go back to what was actually said. Let's go back to what was written. And then we will take that, and then we will figure out what it says about how we should live. So Jesus is speaking with authority in a couple of different senses. A little later on, Jesus talks about how he is Lord of the Sabbath. That fundamentally it is right for my disciples to pick these heads of grain on the Sabbath because I'm Lord of the Sabbath. And I can prove that. But also, Jesus speaks with authority because he always goes back to the Word of God and his reasoning is so good. So there are really two grounds of authority. And there are places in John where Jesus actually discusses all of that in much greater length. Anything else about this one?
It's interesting to me that this is the first one where he doesn't expound further on, we don't get cutting out body parts and that sort of thing here. And I think that's because this was a big mic drop for his audience. That adultery, as much as hard as it is to say it, adultery is kind of commonplace for us. Like, yeah, adultery stinks, but it kind of happens a lot. We're used to it, we see it. Adultery was still a stoning offense at this point. And I think Jesus saying divorce creates adultery. He didn't have to explain why that was a big deal or reinforce, by graphic accusations of adultery or graphic enough here.
That is a great point because, when I think about, Rabbi Hillel or whoever, I don't remember those guys, any of them, even the really restrictive ones, saying, okay, you're not supposed to divorce except for sexual immorality, but if you do, then the result is adultery. Nobody else went that far. That this is an extreme position that Jesus is staking out in defense of marriage. So, anything else here? Okay, what have we got going on then in Matthew 5:33 through 37? We're talking about what? Yeah, talking about oaths. And what's the commandment? Yes, don't swear falsely. You have to fulfill the oaths that you swear. Quoting from Leviticus 19:12. What were the Jews doing with this? How was it going wrong? What was the problem? Well, once again, you have to infer this. But imagine for a moment that you have an evil mind that desires to deceive people. And you have this commandment not to swear false oaths. How are you going to read that? Where are you going to see the loophole? Yeah, if I swear I'm telling the truth, but if I don't swear, then what does that mean it's okay for me to do? What's that? Yes. And that's what they were doing with it. That because of this commandment, they said, well, if I swear an oath, then I'd better keep it. But if I can fool somebody into believing what I say without having to swear an oath, then that is completely legit. The deception is entirely appropriate. And I believe it's Matthew 23, we see that they went even farther than that they had varying degrees of oaths, that some oaths they thought were binding and some weren't. That if you swore by the temple, that was nothing. That was just like verbiage in an ad. But if you swore by the gold in the temple, then people could know that you were serious, and that was an oath you were going to keep. So, thus for how it was being misused, what is Jesus' solution to the problem? Yes. And when it comes to oaths, what does he say about them? Don't do it. Because the way that the Jews of this time had set things up, you kind of had this tiered system, right? Up at the top, you had the good oaths that they were binding. Then you had the non-binding oaths. Then you had the stuff that you said without an oath. And so you went from trustworthy to maybe kind of trustworthy to not trustworthy at all. And does that seem like an appropriate way to serve the God whose word is truth, who does not lie? And so what Jesus does is he takes this wedding cake of different gradations of truth and he just smashes it all down and says, look, I'm going to make sure that you don't try to play games with the truth by doing away with this concept of oaths altogether. That you should be such trustworthy people that regardless of whether you swear an oath or not, people should know that your word is good. That a yes from you should suffice, a no from you should suffice. And the only reason to go to the oath is if you think that your yes or your no will not be believed.
So I have heard this interpreted that I have testified in court before, and I've had people tell me that it is inappropriate for a Christian based on this passage to swear in to testify and to take that oath as part of the court proceedings, that what I am saying is true.
Well, if you want, the court will allow you to affirm. I mean, Quakers have been doing that for centuries. So if somebody has an issue with swearing the oath, then that is certainly available. But I think that that's missing Jesus' point. Because if you put a Christian on the stand, what should you expect him to tell? The truth. If you are talking to a Christian on the street corner, what should you expect him to tell? Yeah, the truth. That the oath is neither here nor there. It's immaterial. If somebody wants you to swear an oath, okay, fine. But I'd have told you the truth if I didn't swear an oath. That it is not significant. So, for my part, I would not have a problem with swearing an oath. But if it makes somebody happy, do it. Any closing thoughts? Yeah, there's a whole discussion in Matthew 23 of the different tiers of binding and non-binding oaths. But Jesus says, whatever you say needs to be binding. All right, that's everything for the evening. Thank you all for your comments. I will see you back next week.